ongoing criminal act of war crimes after war crimes, and we are not willing to continue to take part in these war crimes. As a child in Israel, you are being brought up in a very strong Zionist militaristic education. You don't know almost anything about Palestine. You don't know about the Nakba in 1948. You don't know about the ongoing oppression. And I realized during the Second Intifada that what the Israeli Air Force and the Israeli military is doing is a war crime, terrorizing a population of millions of Palestinians. And when I realized that, I decided to not just leave, but to organize other pilots that will publicly refuse to take part in these crimes. It was a psychological and very difficult process, but once you realize that you are part of a terrorist organization, you understand that you have to say no, you have to take the consequences. I was fired from all companies I worked for in Israel, and it was hard to, because I support the Palestinian struggle, and because I give lectures all around the world, because I am part of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, because I say that Israel is an apartheid state, because I say that my government and my military commanders are war criminals.
During my travels in Palestine, I drove extensively within Israel's borders. What I saw was a seemingly endless expanse of empty land, more than enough space to build new Israeli settlements. But the rush to build thousands of new housing units for Israelis is instead taking place in areas the Israeli government itself designated for a Palestinian state. Because of this, every one of these settlements is illegal under international law. In fact, there's such an outrageous violation of human rights that even Israel's closest ally and sponsor had to issue a public condemnation in early October. But the new settlement project was just the latest in a long list in 2016. In the months prior, the Israeli government had already revealed its plans to build nearly 800 illegal units across the West Bank, then announced an additional 323, then over 200 more. The latest 300, announced in October, shows this expansion is going full speed ahead, with total disregard for internationally agreed upon human rights. But this practice doesn't just mean expanding into Palestinian land. True to Israel's entire history, it's a story of moving in where people already live and kicking them out. Wherever these new settlements are planted, they first evict the Palestinians living there and bulldoze their homes into the ground. In the past 10 years, the Israeli government has seized and demolished over 1,100 Palestinian homes in the West Bank, leaving over 5,000 people homeless, half of them children. Enjoying total impunity with the protection of the U.S. empire, Israel's home demolitions in the West Bank have hit a 10-year high. Over 200 homes have been demolished in 2016 alone, leaving 800 people homeless, 400 of them children. Many hundreds more have orders to evacuate their homes and businesses for demolition. I saw one Palestinian shop that was bulldozed by the Israeli military just the day before. Every home and business in this village is slotted for the same fate. Adding to the cruelty of this practice is how home demolition orders are actually issued to residents. Kasai, an expert who works to delay home demolitions, explains.
The issuing the demolition order goes through the ICA and the Israeli court system. However, this is not the interesting part about it. It's the way they're handed over to people. So when you say, it's not like subpoenas, for example. Speaking to American crowd, subpoenas have to be handed to a person and they have to state their name, saying, it is me, and here, you've hereby been served. When it comes to demolition orders or stop working orders or evacuation orders, they don't have to do that. What they do is, and this is mostly the case, like actually handing it to someone is a rare happening. What they do is, they just simply place it somewhere, on the street, on a wall, on a balcony, whatever, and they would put just a rock on it if they're courteous enough, so that the wind wouldn't blow it away. And then they would come like 10 days after and start demolition. So the people say, hey, we were not given a heads up. No, we did. We gave you a heads up. We gave you a stop working order or a demolition order. But they never got it because it was placed in a place where it's practically impossible for the owner of the land or the property to find out about it.
What is the process to delay demolitions and how successful is that?
Now, the legal way of handling it, and this is what's being done by many legal organizations aiding the farmers and the residents, is the moment you receive a demolition order or a stop working order, you immediately start with the process of the licensing. So while that is happening, by law, the Israelis cannot demolish until there is a sentence in a court. And we keep on going with appeal after appeal after appeal to stretch the period until the demolition actually takes place. Now, this is the only resort we have, is just stalling in courts, like trying to use the Israeli system against itself. But in the end, no matter how much we stall, the structure is going to be demolished. Now, if you're lucky, you're talking about something small. But most of the cases, you're talking about a home, not a house, a home where people live, families, just on the street.
Villages all across the West Bank have new settlements encroaching on their residents. Instead of building in the acres of empty land, they move in right next door and expand into Palestinian neighborhoods.
This is the Palestinian village of Rathee'S. It's about 100 meters away from a deeper Israeli settlement. Most of the original Palestinian residents have been kicked out to make room for the settlers, and now languish in nearby refugee camps.
Again, these settlements are illegal because they are in the areas that Israel itself has agreed to for Palestine, which it claimed could be a future Palestinian state. We showed you how war and colonization reduced Palestine mainly to the shrinking West Bank. But inside this area lies another story. A mass uprising against Israel's brutal occupation led to a peace agreement in 1993 known as the Oslo Accords. But the supposed path to a two-state solution instead entrenched Israeli occupation and expansion. As part of the Oslo Agreement, the Israeli government insisted Palestine's West Bank be divided into 3 separate areas of control: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is the only area where Palestinians have any sort of sovereignty. Area A means it is under civil and security control by the Palestinian Authority, or PA, widely considered a mere proxy occupation that closely collaborates with Israeli forces. These small islands of territory are less than 18% of the West Bank. Most Palestinians must move between these pockets to get to work, school, see family, a doctor, and everything else people do. This means passing through long, dangerous military checkpoints, where they are often harassed and brutalized. Leaving Area A brings them into Area B, which is 22% of the West Bank. Area B means the PA has control of civil society, but security by Israel. This means total occupation by the Israeli military, with non-stop, random checkpoints. This is where the settlements in question are being built, in Area B, as opposed to Area C, which is most of the West Bank, around 60%, containing the vast majority of the West Bank's resources, including water. Area C means it is under total Israeli control. 99% of it has been formally seized by the Israeli government. Israeli soldiers and towers are everywhere. Over 350,000 Israeli settlers have already moved in.
Most of the demolitions in a reasonable world should be in Area C, because this is where the Israelis have the administrative order over licensing. But recently we've been hearing a lot about demolition orders being conducted in Area B, which is not only illegal, but outrageous, because they don't have the authority to do that there. Not that that have stopped the Israelis before, like legalities, but it's still a shocking thing that has been in the picture right now.
Here's how it works. A Jewish settler from anywhere in the world, many of whom are born and raised in the United States, can plant a trailer home onto Palestinian land. They often choose the top of a hill overlooking a Palestinian village. Though illegal under Israeli law, the Israeli government will hook that new camp up with electricity, run pipes for water, and build settler-only roads for them to travel. The Israeli military also deploys soldiers and sets up a military outpost for so-called security. To kick out the Palestinians who live there, the settlers carry out acts of harassment and outright terrorism. The Israeli military not only protects the settlers, but also carries out their own attacks on the village and serve the official demolition orders. The Palestinian villages are razed, and the settlement grows into a fortified, walled-off monstrosity. Signs marking the settlements in Palestinian territory bear the ominous image of a howling wolf at their gates. The Palestinians have very little legal recourse.
It's a practice, it's a systematic punishment system. The moment we have many stories about people who have, for example, settler attacks at their homes, and they go complain to the Israeli police because they're Area C. So, as a punishment for them, for complaining, now many of their rights are taken away from them. For example, you have people who live in Area C and or even Area B, but filed a complaint, and they're in their 60s. So, by Israeli regulations, they're allowed to enter Jerusalem without any kind of permits, knowing that Jerusalem is actually in the West Bank. So many of them surprised to see that when they try to cross, they tell them, no, there's a standing lawsuit against you. Or you're involved, let's say, you're involved in a lawsuit, so you're not allowed to pass until the issue is resolved. And we know that the issue is never resolved, because it's always against an unknown, against an anonymous perpetrator. So it's a permanent punishment, making him an example for anyone else. Like, if you want to complain, not only nothing will happen, something bad is going to happen.
Even though it's them filing the complaint against someone who's attacking them.
It's a relative that you are the oppressed or the oppressor, you're the complainee or someone complained against you. Your name is involved in a legal action, so you cannot move, you cannot... and there's also like other ways they do it, like for example, you're head of a family and you file a complaint against an attack from settlers or an unlawful demolition order or etc., anything else within those lines. Not only that they would punish you, they would punish your family. Let's say your kids have permits to go and work inside the occupied territories. Those permits will now be revoked. So it's not just punishing the person, but his entire family, and making it clear as an example for other people, do not attempt to do what this person or this family did.
Because one of the most shocking things to me being here is seeing not only the illegal settlements, of course, that we all know about, but the illegal outposts that are actually illegal under Israeli law, not just international law. Can you talk about what these are, how the government helps aid and abet them?
As a Palestinian, I can tell you all settlements are illegal. They're established in the West Bank, and this is supposed to be the future Palestinian state. So any expansion and change in the demography, that's illegal. Now, when you're talking about illegal outposts that are even illegal by the Israeli standards, let's say there's this huge settlement, let's say Bracha, okay? A few settlers would move to the next hilltop and set up a caravan. And that caravan becomes two. And then those settlers need protection. So a military outpost is built right next to it. And that becomes a seed for a new settlement that's going to take that entire hilltop. Give it a couple of years, and that becomes a legal settlement. And notice that even those are illegal, somehow they manage to get power cables stretched for them from the main settlement that they emerged from. Water lines, roads are being opened for them.
After years of operating illegally, even under Israeli law, many of these settlements are rewarded. Over 1/3 of these unauthorized settlements have been retroactively legalized under Israeli law. One Israeli settlement researcher described, "We see it as a very gradual move toward annexation. Annexation means absorbing West Bank settlements into Israeli borders, dispelling the claim that Israel desires coexistence with an ever-shrinking Palestinian state." One of the hotbeds of expansion and settler violence against Palestinians is in the town of Kusra, which is split between areas B and C, and has already lost half of its land to settlements. Settlers have damaged or burned hundreds of olive trees, killed dozens of sheep, torched cars, and have set fire to a mosque in dozens of attacks over the years. Ibrahim Wadi has been the mayor of Kusra for more than 6 years. I spoke to him in his office about the continued assaults against his village, flanked by a developed settlement on one side and a growing outpost on the other.
Kusra is surrounded by Majdaluun settlement, which is also the main entry into the town. In the south, there are also settlement outposts, such as Esh Kodesh, Kida, Abd al-Al, Shino, and Shibat Rahim. In the past 6 years, Kusra was subjected to several attacks, most of which were from this outpost to the south, which is Esh Kodesh. The settlers from Esh Kodesh burned the Al-Nurian Mosque of Kusra. They burned many vehicles in the eastern area. They also would kill the farmers' sons in the town. There are lots of farms with olive trees, which they destroyed, as we see on this map. We also notice in this image, they destroyed more than 2,728 olive trees in the past 6 years. Kusra used to live as a stable rural setting, far away from settlement issues and the violence of settlers. But in the past 6 years, settler violence has intensified, which has led to the deterioration of our economic condition and the psychological condition of children in the town. The settlers are groups who are outside the law. In the partition of our town, it was partly in Area B and partly in Area C. We note that parts of these lands occupied by the settlers are in Area B. These lands are supposed to be under absolute Palestinian control. This is indicative of the double standards of Israeli law and also the Israeli police. They chase after the farmers and distribute evacuation orders, such as this order on this farm. The chief inspector pursues the people on the premise that they are in Area C, under Israeli control. But this is Area B, which is under Palestinian control. In the town of Kusra, we are now living in a state of chaos, outside the law, outside human rights and the rights of man. Majdaluun settlement has been in the town of Kusra since 1971. This settlement, according to the classifications and known criteria, is a legal settlement. But in the past few days, it has started expanding into Palestinian land, along with the expropriation of many assets to expand this settlement. At the same time, they keep us from entering our farmlands, which are near the settlement.
The attacks on Palestinians also target one of their major sources of income, olive trees. The olive tree is not only a symbol of Palestinian life and culture, but families also depend on olives for their livelihood. Over 30% of their olive trees are behind Israeli security fences. And in the past 40 years, over 1 million olive trees have been destroyed in Palestinian lands.
The olives in this land have been there from before the occupation. How are we to get to it? It poses a danger to the citizen's life to leave Kusra to come to this land near Esh Kodesh. He needs to be protected from the settlers' attacks. In addition, the Israelis determine the work hours for our harvesting work. It is not allowed to start before 9 in the morning and continue after 4 in the afternoon. With us, harvesting the olives starts at 7 a.m. and ends at 7 p.m., so this presents us with a problem. They give us only 6 days in the year, 3 days to plow the land and 3 days to pick the olives. This also affects our economic condition because it is not enough time for the farmer to pick the fruit and also to trim and take care of the trees. From this policy, the area becomes barren land. And according to the Ottoman Empire law, revised in 1982, if land is considered barren for 5 years, it becomes property of the state. That means that it becomes Israeli-controlled and expands the settlements. Of course, we have houses in the southern area near Esh Kodesh. They attacked this house more than once. They tried to chase this farmer from his house by attacking him, smashing his windows, and continuously beating him. Palestinians are not allowed to expand. Palestinians are not allowed to build. There are rules over the Palestinian lands to benefit the settlers in their expansion. We are here in the southern part of Kusra's village. This village continuously suffers from confrontations and attacks by Israeli settlers from the outpost of Aish Kodesh. As I mentioned, this outpost represents a constant threat to the southern part of the village, the houses, the public park, as well as the agricultural areas. The goal of these attacks is to control the fertile farmlands. The Israeli settlers from the outpost of Aish Kodesh illegally occupied these hills in the southern part of the village. In the beginning, the outpost was established at the main entrance of Kusra in 1981, which was small and inside of a fence. Since then, it has expanded into Palestinian farms, including the crops and fields around it. In accordance with the Oslo Accords, the Kusra village should have been provided protection. But since the Palestinian National Authority has limited authority, we have had to form youth protection committees ourselves. The settlers burned the mosque, which is located in the neighborhood behind us, many vehicles and houses. Many of the farmers' children left their parents' homes because they couldn't tolerate the random, inhumane attacks. We all need to be humane, whether Palestinian or Israeli. We all should respect each other and our neighbor. Currently, thousands of acres, including wheat farms and olive trees, have been seized by the settlers of Aish Kodesh. During the past 14 years, we have been able to harvest the olive trees only one time. The settlers don't allow us access to the olive trees and keep us away with weapons. These are real facts, and this is our land. We have history and rights here. The farmers can smell the scent of their ancestors in the soil. We are staying here, and we are not going anywhere.
According to a recent UN report, Israeli settler attacks on Palestinians have quadrupled in the past decade. Khalid's is the last house remaining in Area B in the town of Burim. When a settlement trailer appeared on the hilltop above his home, his family began to be attacked.
لا هاي هي المستوطنة اللي كنت أحكي لك عنها من شوي، اللي هي بلشت في بيت واحد بس، وزي ما أنت شايفة بلشت تتوسع، صارت عدة بيوت، حتى إنه كيف بلشوا يستولوا على الأراضي اللي جنبها، وصار يبنوا هناك البيوت القريبة هاي، صاروا ينزلوا في البنى شوي شوي يتوسعوا، وفي محاولة للسيطرة على الجبل بكامل، على أساس إنه يحاولوا يسيطروا يعني على القريب بشكل كامل. وإحنا بهاي الطريقة إنه اضطرينا إنه الشبابيك حطينا لهم حراسات أو مربعات إنه شبك في حال إنه نمنع الكسر الشبابيك. وممكن إنه احتمال برضو ينزلوا من هاي الجهة، إنه يجونا من هون ويلفونا هيك ويصيروا يضربوا من هاي الجهة كمان، ومن هاي الجهة كمان بينزلوا، يعني من كل الاتجاهات بينزلوا في إمكانهم، بحكم إنهم هم حاكمين أصلا كل الجبل، فبينزلوا من وين ما بدهم، بينزلوا من هون، بينزلوا من هون، بينزلوا من هون. فإحنا في حال إنه نزلوا صعب إنه نشوفهم، حتى الكاميرات ما بيبينوا، لأنه هاي الهضبة موجودة أو التلة هاي موجودة. فبنتفاجأ إنهم صاروا هون وما نكون إحنا في البيت وما بنسمع إلا بصير صوت حجار، ونطلع هيك بنشوف المواجهات، بنشوفهم كانوا بصيروا هون. هذا 15 واحد. اعتداءات متكررة من طرف المستوطنين باستمرار. بينزلوا هون يرموا الحجار وبيحاولوا يكسروا ويخربوا أي إشي. مضايقات باستمرار على سبيل إنه بدهم يحاولوا يرحلونا إنه نترك الدار ونروح. فالاعتداءات هاي المتكررة دائما تكون بشكل وحشي. حاولوا مرة أكثر من مرة إنه يحرقوا البيت، وحركوا مرة سيارة، ودائما باستمرار برموا الحجار وبكسروا أي إشي، يعني بحاول إنه قبل الكسر راح ينكسر. وعدا عن ذلك إذا كان مثلا عندنا أولاد صغار يعني أطفال أي إشي، هذا أكيد راح يسبب لهم مثلا حالة نفسية أو خوف باستمرار. شو كمان ممكن أحكي؟
Can you tell me more about how you were physically attacked by settlers?
دائما هلا في حال إنه هجموا علينا المستوطنين. إنه أنا عندي هون أبوي وأمي كانوا الواحد راح يكون أكيد يخاف عليهم. فأبوي وأمي كبار في السن مسنين، فأنا اللي راح يعني أطلع مثلا وفي حال هجموا أنا اللي راح أطلع أواجههم، وأكيد راح يصير يرموا علي حجار إلا ما يكون في إصابات. مثلا أنت لما تواجه 10-20 مستوطن كلهم بيرموا حجار عليك، إلا أكيد إنه راح يصيبك إشي منهم.
And talk about what this outpost is and how the government's protecting it.
المستوطنين بس ينزلوا أو يحاولوا يهجموا، طبعا إنه الجيش الإسرائيلي إنه بدعي إنه مش بإيدهم، بس في حال إنه هجموا المستوطنين علينا بيجوا الجيش. لما يجوا الجيش الإسرائيلي بتشجعوا أكثر، وبصير إنه الجيش الإسرائيلي يعني بيحميهم. يعني في حال أنت ضربت مستوطن أو دافعت وضربت على المستوطنين حجار، راح الجيش الإسرائيلي يساند المستوطنين ويقوم بضرب إذا اضطروا إنه مثلا يطخوا أو يرموا مسيلات الدموع والصوتيات راح يأذونا. بس هم يعني بتشجعوا أكثر في إنه يهجموا بزيادة في حال إنه كان الجيش الإسرائيلي موجود. حسب الأوضاع اللي بتكون موجودة في فلسطين بشكل عام بيأثر علينا وعلى اعتداءات المستوطنين علينا. يعني بالأخير بيت الواحد مستحيل لو على رواحنا إنه ما بنترك البيت. يعني نحنا خلص بنستنى مثلا الفرج من رب العالمين إنه راح نضل هون أكيد، يعني مش راح نترك البيت، وإحنا هون إن شاء الله للأبد يعني لحتى الله يأخذ أمانته يعني.
This inhumane crisis of evictions and demolitions is led by the religious extremist settler movement. True to Israel's entire history, this movement is carrying out the same project of total conquest of Palestine and expulsion of its indigenous inhabitants, no matter the cost. All of this is being done under the claim that settlers are acting in self-defense from the so-called terrorists that want to kill them. But only one side in this fight has a license to kill, and will commit nothing short of unspeakable horrors to ensure their takeover continues. And as I saw myself, no one, even the most innocent, is safe. At the time of this recording, at least 217 people have been killed by Israeli bombs in Gaza. 63 of them were children, the vast majority non-combatants. Israel has leveled residential buildings, towers housing international media outlets, all the roads leading to Gaza's trauma hospital, a Doctors Without Borders hospital, and refugee camps. In the al-Shati refugee camp massacre on May 15th, they killed 7 members of the same family huddled in their home. And in one single air raid on May 16th, they killed 42 civilians, including 10 children. Every single one of these civilian dead, Israel claims were human shields, so there's nothing to condemn. It's not their fault, it's the fault of Hamas. Nothing to answer for, no pressure to stop, no accountability. We're just supposed to take their word for it. This is repeated without question by corporate media. For example, when Israel leveled the building housing Associated Press offices, claiming it was a secret base for Hamas, they provided no evidence whatsoever, even in secret, to the U.S. State Department. But CNN, instead of grilling Israel about the claim, instead grilled the Associated Press about turning a blind eye to Hamas. The human shield narrative is really the only defense Israel and the U.S. have for excusing these brutal crimes against humanity. Here's the thing. Claiming civilians you kill are human shields is not some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. Why is it up to Israel to determine if their actions are war crimes or not? I'm going to give you 5 points that completely evaporate Israel's human shield defense and explain why it must be something to answer for in an international criminal court. Point 1. Israel provides no evidence that there are human shields. So far, the best they can do is share these photoshopped images. See, the building is red. That means Hamas is there. You know, for all of Israel's sophisticated surveillance technology with eyes over every single inch of Gaza, you'd think that they'd be able to produce more than cartoons and doctored graphics. In fact, the only proof they have provided so far are fake videos of Hamas rockets in residential areas. On May 15th, the IDF published a video of an Israeli training operation using a Hamas decoy, but claimed it was an actual Hamas missile launcher near civilians. In another lie, Netanyahu's spokesman tweeted a video claiming it was Hamas firing rockets next to an apartment building. Turns out this was a video from 2018 in Syria. So where's the actual evidence? If they cannot provide any, their claims must be investigated and brought to a trial. Even if there was evidence that Israel was hitting legitimate military targets, it still is illegal to kill such an outrageous amount of civilians. And you can't legally blow up a hospital, even if there are militants nearby. Either way, Israel should not be allowed to be above the law. Point 2. We shouldn't take Israel's claims of human shields at face value, because they have an extensive history of lying about it. I think the most irrefutable example are their killings at Gaza's Great March of Return, which we documented in our film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. At this Great March, Israeli snipers directly targeted and killed 183 unarmed demonstrators, including 35 innocent children at these protests, journalists marked press, medics performing medical aid, a man in a wheelchair, and so many more. But Israel said they were all human shields, so it was all legitimate. Here's where they really exposed themselves. According to international law, human shield applies to civilians as collateral damage when you're targeting military forces in combat. But at the Great March protests, there were no militants, nobody shooting at Israelis, nobody with weapons, no targets remotely connected to military operations. So if all of those children, medics, journalists, and disabled people were human shields, who were they shielding? Even when they killed celebrated female medic Razan al-Najjar, they released a propaganda video saying she was a human shield. But shielding what? Under no circumstances would killing that many civilians at an unarmed protest, with the defense that they were human shields for non-existent military targets, hold up for a second in a war crimes tribunal. Today, Israel relies on the fog of war to make this claim seem possible. But just 2 years ago, Israel showed an irrefutable pattern of lying about human shields, and now they have zero credibility. Point 3. According to Israel's own definition of human shield, every man, woman, and child in Gaza is a human shield. They claim that anyone in the vicinity of not only Hamas missile sites, but Hamas offices, Hamas individuals, is a human shield. This includes Hamas members who are sleeping at home with their families and the surrounding houses. This includes anyone within a mile of any Hamas institution, which is literally all of the 2 million people who live there. Look, Hamas is the government of Gaza. Therefore, any civilian infrastructure is considered Hamas infrastructure, everything from transportation to healthcare. So anyone in the vicinity of those things or people can be killed with impunity. Even Israel's Minister of Defense confirmed that this is indeed their view, stating on May 18th that, quote, no person, area, or neighborhood in Gaza is immune from airstrikes. How is it in any way acceptable that Israel can categorize every human being in Gaza a legitimate target? And if you take Israel's logic far enough, they could kill everyone in Gaza, and it would be justified. Point 4. If you accept Israel's definition of human shield, then you have to accept that Israel is using human shields as well. Armed Israeli soldiers are everywhere among civilian areas. Not only that, but their military bases are nestled in densely populated residential areas. For example, the Israeli Defense Forces' main headquarters is smack dab in the middle of a residential sector of Tel Aviv and a major shopping center. Does anyone accuse Israel of using human shields? In another example, the Israeli army broadcasts from a residential apartment tower with antennas on the roof. If Hamas leveled that building, does anyone doubt it would be deemed a war crime? What we have here is a double standard. Israel wants the human shield defense for them to be any civilian they kill. But for any civilian killed by Hamas, it's a war crime. You know, the purpose of international laws of war is to create a standard that's applied to all sides equally. But Israel and the United States have a different view, that the rules only apply to their enemies. Point 5. If everyone in Gaza is a legitimate human shield, that's only because of Israel's own design. This is a situation of Israel's own making. Israel drew the borders, and Israel refuses to let anyone leave. To leave Gaza, you must get approval from the Israeli government, and the government will almost always say no. So what are people supposed to do who want to remove themselves from the carnage? They have literally nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Israel has made Gaza, in every sense of the term, an open-air prison. They trap 2 million civilians in this tiny strip of land. Then they bomb their neighborhoods and say, well, they shouldn't have been there. The mountain of civilian dead has to be looked at through the perspective of the Israeli blockade and the inability of anyone to escape. Resistance forces in Gaza have nowhere else to go to. Gaza's self-defense capabilities are confined to this heavily populated area. And Israel has intentionally made Gaza unlivable. The only way Gaza is able to exert pressure on Israel is by firing rockets. If they peacefully protest their conditions, they're massacred just the same. If they do nothing, Israel continues to blockade them, erode their living conditions, while ethnically cleansing the rest of their land. Israel has made it so the only leverage Gaza has to get any change is using the one weapon it has. Besides, Gaza has the right to self-defense under international law, and contrary to what Israel claims, the current round of fighting was started by Israel, not Hamas, when they deployed criminal violence against Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah. And right at the outset, on May 12th, Hamas offered a ceasefire to Israel. Israel rejected it because they wanted to keep going, despite their rhetoric of only wanting the rockets to stop. So if Israel's going to keep bombing, Gaza has no choice but to fight back. And that in turn becomes the excuse for Israel massacring so-called human shields. It's far from the first time this term has been used to state-sponsored mass slaughter. Human shield propaganda has been long applied by the empire to dehumanize the enemy in nearly every major world conflict or war, from its atrocities in Korea to Iraq. And it always serves the same purpose: to dehumanize entire populations, giving the perpetrators a free pass to act with total disregard for civilian life. What the Israeli government is trying to do is cover up what their military is actually doing, which is indiscriminate bombing. That seems glaringly apparent, and international law is very clear about indiscriminate attacks being a war crime, strictly prohibited in any situation. To sum it all up, it is completely outrageous to let Israel make this blanket claim to absolve itself of any wrongdoing. All of those lives taken had value. They all had families. They all had futures they were robbed of. It's not fair, and it's not right to be able to wash away their deaths with such an audacious lie. This is an unconscionable situation. What everyone should agree on is that if an army, especially a colonizing power attacking a population it occupies and completely controls, is going to kill such an outrageous number of civilians, they shouldn't be their own judge and jury. This is what war crimes tribunals are for, and that is exactly what Israel needs to face.
With the Trump administration in power, Israeli politicians have been celebrating this new opportunity, ramping up settlement projects. Some of these are even financed by Trump's own son-in-law, rumored to be the president's pick to broker so-called peace in the region.
Can I reveal, Jared, how long we've known you?
While these illegal settlements grow into Palestinian villages, some are built directly in the middle of thriving cultural centers, such as Hebron, one of the most hyper-militarized cities in the world. When I was in Hebron, I was shocked by how aggressively the police state imposed an apartheid system. All of the residents I talked to had horror stories of life under brutal occupation. Sometimes Israeli soldiers themselves dissent, even in the face of very severe repercussions. One of whom is Eran Efrati, who was stationed in Hebron during his time in the Israeli army. Since leaving the military after years as a combat soldier, Efrati has dedicated his life to documenting Israeli war crimes and fighting the apartheid system.
Eran, you went from being a soldier in the IDF to being a very outspoken critic of both the occupation and continued takeover of Palestine. What made you go through such a profound transformation?
Well, it didn't something that happened immediately. Obviously, growing up in Israel, you ask me what was my role in the military. I'm not sure that my role started with my enlisted. I think my role started when I was about 5, and I realized that my father is putting uniform and going out to Lebanon as a reserve soldier. That's the first time I felt that I'm a part of the military. The next time was in kindergarten, when soldiers came in to tell us about the Independent War, just after the Holocaust Day Memorial. The next time will be when I was 16, and I will get my first draft letter. And in this draft letter, it will be written that I am a property of the military. This is something that every kid in Israel goes through. When you're getting into the military system, in the end, you're already so much embedded inside the military. The military is a part of your identity. It's as much you as you are Israeli or Jewish, for that matter, in Israel. And going into the military, I was expecting to be a manifestation of me, just in uniform, protecting my country, protecting my family. I grew up on hearing the stories from Auschwitz of my grandma. So my mother's side, my grandma and grandpa was the only survivors from their family, from the Holocaust. All of my grandma's family were killed in Auschwitz. the stories from my grandpa that was also the only survivor from his family from the Holocaust, and from the other side, my grandpa and grandma from my father's side grew up and hearing their stories about Jerusalem and what it is to grow up without freedom under the British mandate. For me, being in the military is to protect them and to make sure that our life will go on as in freedom and in good well. I went through 7 months of boot camp, and in the end of the 7 months, I found myself in Hebron. This is the only city that have a settlement in the middle of the city. So getting into the Hebron, one of the first things that I had to do was protect a Jewish holiday. And my job is to put on curfew 180,000 Palestinians. So settlers throughout the West Bank and Israel, Jewish settlers, could come into Hebron and celebrate. So there's thousands and thousands of Israelis and Jewish settlers from across the West Bank coming to celebrate. And the only way to keep them protected is to make sure that no Palestinian is leaving his home. So literally one of my first tasks was to roam the streets and make sure Palestinians understand they're going into their home and they cannot leave until a second notice, until the next time we're coming in. And the first time was like a movie. We birthed into the city with our guns in our hands and our uniform and vest with grenades and 6 packs of ammunition. And we're just screaming curfew. And you see the chaos. You see the people just running from place to place, closing down their shops, running home, because wherever you are when the curfew starts, this is where you're stuck. And you cannot go anywhere else. So you better be at home when we're starting to come the curfew. Now, the official orders to anyone who breaks curfew is shoot to kill. I never did that. I never met anyone who shoot to kill in this process of a curfew. But that was the orders, and they knew it pretty well. They knew what they need to do. This feeling of power at once came as a big confusion to me. I think I wasn't clear if I'm enjoying the power of controlling all of these people, or if I don't understand why kids look at me frightened. Why are they running away when I'm walking into the street? Before my service, I work as an educator. I love kids. So I think I was very confused on why a kid will find me scary. I realize now in perspective, it got to do something with the fact that I have my boots on, my uniform, my helmet, my 6 packs of ammunition, my 2 hand grenades, my M16 in my hand, but I didn't realize that at the time. Right. And I really couldn't understand that. And I think in a very rapid pace, I realized that my job is actually to maintain an apartheid system. Very early on, I understood that the rights that the Jewish settlers have are not the rights that the Palestinians have. I understood that I cannot touch a Jewish settler if he is attacking a Palestinian. The best I can do is call a local police department to come handle it, like I would do at home in Jerusalem. So these Jewish settlers that live in Hebron are living under the same rights that I live in Jerusalem, but the Palestinian next to them, next house over, next building over, sometimes next apartment over, lives under my rule, my military rule. And I can do whatever I want with him. I can take his home as a temporary base for a few hours to a few days to a few weeks. I can decide that I'm arresting the people of the house and tying them up to the fence of my base. If we will get an order to demolish their home or just lock their front door and don't let them out into the street their house is on, a street that only Jewish settlers can walk on and Palestinians cannot. So they have to walk through windows to yards, into the other side, into the Kasbah of Hebron. I think realizing all of that in a very, very early stage in my service helped me understood that someone was lying to me along the way. I didn't feel like I'm protecting anyone. I didn't feel like I'm helping anyone feeling more safe. I felt like I'm terrorizing people. I felt like for the first time in my life, the boundaries between good and bad that I learned as a kid, and obviously I learned that I'm on the good side, was broken. I felt like I am the terrorist. And my job was literally to scare people so they cannot think about acting against the Israeli settlers or the Israeli military. That was actually our defined mission, to make sure that to instill fear in the hearts of Palestinians in Hebron. And that's exactly what we did.
I think Hebron is a really intense example of apartheid, obviously. Like you just said, the settlements in the middle of the city, it's extremely visible. You have the cage streets, the ghost town. It's horrifying. Why did you speak up, and why did you do what you did knowing that you would suffer such repercussions and potentially be banned from returning back to your country?
Well, growing up in Israel, like I said, I believe that I was the good guy. I mean, the story that all of us are being told all around the world is that the very clear difference between good and bad people are there. You learn about the Holocaust growing up. I saw my grandma screaming in the middle of the nights, memories from Auschwitz in our mind, memories to our family. I knew that I am going to be a good human being. You know, in the age of 15, 16, I began being almost obsessed with trying to understand the Nazi side in the Holocaust. Not only to hear the stories of the victims, of the Jewish victims and any other victims from the Holocaust, but to try to understand how can a Nazi soldiers get up in the morning, give his kids a kiss, his wife a hug, and go out to the camps and do his job. I just couldn't understand that. And when I got into the occupied territories, for the first time I understood how can there be a contradiction inside yourself. As a human being, you could do your job and be a one person at home, be a loving, caring boyfriend or a son or a brother, and in the same time hold people under a regime so oppressed that people are dying not from only your bullets, but the amount of calories being entered into their territory, like in Gaza, from depression or sickness. This realization during my time as a soldier of me on the right side of history gave me this urge that something have to be done, something have to be spoken. Understanding that nothing is really changing from inside, that you have to step outside and start talking with the world about what's going on. And that's the only way you can live in a place, not only for Palestinians, but for me as well. You know, I don't want to live in an ethnocracy. I don't want to live in an only Jewish state that values privileged Jewish life on every other life. This urges me to understand that I want my kids to grow up in a place when they don't have to oppress anyone, they don't have to be soldiers. I guess that's what pushed me to do what I'm doing.
Your humanity. Let's talk about your time after getting out of the military, and then you went through a series through the West Bank, interviewing soldiers, getting their testimony. Talk about some of your experiences there that cemented your belief system now and opened your mind a little bit more.
I think after I left the military, I was still under the impression that the things that I was going through were my personal experience. I understood that I do not believe in the things that I was doing. I understood that I was lied to, but I still didn't have the conviction that what we're doing is on a large scale. And leaving the military and starting interviewing soldiers really, I think, made me understand that there's a systematic oppression that is taking place in the occupied territories.
Iran, let's talk about Elor Azaria, the soldier who just got convicted of manslaughter. He executed an unarmed Palestinian man laying in the street, of course, in Hebron, on camera. Israel, of course, is touting this as accountability, right? Justice. Mm-hmm. What is your reaction to the verdict and, just the case in general?
Well, I think the Elor Azaria case had to be understood by a few contexts. Mm-hmm. The first one is the context of Israeli military practice of executions and targeted killing, and also confirming a kill, what Elor Azaria did on the Palestinian in Hebron, are all practices that are alive in the military system, in the even police system or Mossad. It's illegal to continue doing execution. It's the middle of the previous decade, in the 2000s. But then something very interesting started. I am, in my previous role as a researcher into the Israeli military, I was taking testimonies from many soldiers. And one of the soldiers I'm reaching to is a soldier from a semi-elite unit called in Hebrew Duvdevan, Cherry in English. And he's telling me a story about how he's serving after this new rule from the Supreme Court has been mandated, and they cannot do targeting and killing anymore. And how their officer is gathering the unit together and telling them, we're going to go out tonight to capture this person. Is highly dangerous. What we're going to do is we're going to come in 5 or 6 people's unit into their home in the middle of the night, break in quietly, go up to his bedroom, go into his bed, and point a gun into his head. Now, if he just wake up and surrender, we're taking him into the base. But if he scream, you shoot him in the head. If he lifts his blanket, you shoot him in the head. If he lifts his hands or legs or trying to do any movement, you shoot him in the head. Now, because we understand as rational human beings that no human being can wake up in the middle of the night with a gun into his head and not scream or move, we understand these orders as an execution orders that bypass the Supreme Court order. And instead of saying we're going to execute this person, they're saying we're going to arrest this person, but if we feel there's some kind of danger, maybe he have a gun in his bed, maybe he will scream for help, we execute him. So execution is something that is very much alive. I continue to interview dozens of this Cherry unit that tells the same story about different cases, but the same exact practice in the occupied territories. They knew that this is what they're supposed to do. They knew that they were going into homes in the middle of the night to execute people. In October 2015, the latest intifada is starting, and even the official rules of not executing human beings are going off the window. From the prime minister, into ministers, into media people, everybody is talking about it from left to right, about you shoot to kill. If you see a girl with scissors next to you, you shoot to kill. Executions are very much alive in the Israeli military, the Israeli police, the Israeli discourse. People are calling for executions. People are calling for not only executions on, what they call terrorist or resistant people, Palestinians that are running at you, but they're calling for revenge. And when Elior Azaria doing what he does, he's doing it after he heard it, this specific order of executions, every what they call a terrorist from every section of the Israeli society.
We wouldn't be talking about Elior Azaria if the execution wasn't on a film, let's be honest. I mean, like you said, this is commonplace, this is systematic, it's institutionalized. However, I do want to talk about how even before he was charged with manslaughter, it was a slap on the wrist at the beginning. I don't know if there was just international pressure that mounted at a certain point where they felt like they had to take the investigation forward. But even then, it was a very stark contrast between how right-wing Israelis reacted to just a house arrest verdict. Then let's say people hear when a police officer shoots and executes an unarmed black man, and usually you have protests in the street against the police trying to get accountability. There in Israel, it seemed like there was mass rallies in support of Elior Azaria.
Of course, it's not surprising. Israel is selling this idea of the soldiers are more important than anything. The soldiers are more important than the life of Palestinians. Not only the life of soldiers, the soldiers' identity, security, feelings are more important than a Palestinian life. The easiness, the comfortable of people going out to the street and defending every case of manslaughtering that was captured on tape, that is clear that his life is not in danger, they contradict everything that we are being told. And yet, Israelis are saying in a very clear voice, not only that we don't believe in that, not only that we will oppress Palestinian and will act as much as, do whatever we want, but in a very specific way saying, don't confuse us with the idea of moral or right or wrong. Whatever soldiers do in the occupied territories are right. Whatever we're doing is the correct thing.
I wanted you to talk specifically about the culture within the Israeli military that fosters anti-Arab sentiment and racism, essentially.
Yes, I think the system, is not only inside the military. It's like I said before, that's actually what being an Israeli means. Being an Israeli, growing up in the Israeli educational departments, you understand that all the Arabs hates you, that they're actually, in a way, the continuation of the biblical Amalek or Hitler, or, that everybody there want to throw you into the sea. This is what you're growing up with, and you really believe in that. I mean, going into the military, you're already going so full of hate and fear at the same time that you don't need much to be very aggressive, violent, and racist toward Palestinians. They see the Palestinian women and the Palestinian men as subhuman. The occupied territories are like an ex-territory, when those human beings are not considered to be human beings. This is a process that you start in a very early age, being enforced inside your boot camp, and later on when you're going into your service, when you do not see human beings in front of you. Do not believe their sorrow, do not believe their smiles, do not believe their feelings. They are subhuman.
But they look just like you. I mean, there's so many Arab Jews. It's incredible. Yeah. Like yourself.
Yeah, and I think that the Arab Jews in Israel are probably the most tragic story in the entire story of Zionism after the Palestinians. And it's not being talked enough, obviously, inside the Israeli society or in the world. The Mizrahi Jew, the Arab Jews that came around the years of 50 and onward into Israel, some came by choice, some came by force, but they didn't came to a country that was theirs. Came only about 2 years after Israel was already gave out most of the land into the European people. And they understood that they cannot hold the territory alone. They need more people on the ground to fight off Palestinians or Palestinian refugees if they will come back. And then they went off and brought most of the Arab Jews and put them in the most terrible places in Israel, on the borders with Egypt or Jordan or Lebanon and Syria. We put them at buffer zones to protect us from Palestinians. Some of them came in the 70s. The Zionist organization sends delegations into these Arab countries and called the Jews there to come into Israel, the Jewish homeland. Many of them didn't want to. Many of them, like in Iraq or Egypt, had a good life, or in Morocco, and wanted to stay. They didn't know what will be the destiny of this new country, that understood that there's very much likely that a lot of wars will go on there. They felt protected in those countries, and they said no. And the Zionist organization sent another delegations into some of these countries of people disguised as Arabs from those countries, that terrorized those people to try to force them to come into Israel. They were born synagogues. We have testimonies today that talks about how they ran after people in the street and beat them down as so-called Arabs from Morocco, from Egypt or Iraq, trying to scare them. And immediately after that, more people from the Zionist movement would come and say, you see, the only safe place you have is Israel. You have to come now. And after they came, they were being sent into the most disgusting forms of settlement for the newcomers from those Arab countries, being sprayed from DDT with gas, trying to clean them up before they joining into the Ashkenazi, the European kids, to play with them. They were separated and segregated for years. That was not their country, and it's still not their country. And what they had to do to start to assimilate themselves inside this new country was to make sure that everybody understood that they're actually not Arabs. They look like Arabs, they talk Arabic, but they're not Arabs, they're Jewish, because you can be an American Jew and you can be a European Jew, but you cannot be an Arab Jew in Israel. And they erase their identity, and they starting to form what we know today as the most extreme right in Israel. They are the extreme right because they have to solidify themselves as the most loyal citizens of the states.
You hear this as a cycle of violence, though, and every time I bring up, especially being on the ground in the West Bank, visiting the Dawabsha family, or who's left of it, whenever you bring up these horrifying stories and accounts of terror on behalf of the Israeli settlers, a lot of people just say, what about the stabbing attacks? What about the terrorist attacks on behalf of Palestinians? And it's painted as a equal fight, as a cycle of violence. And then you have the truck attack that just happened in Jerusalem. As a former soldier, how do you view these attacks? How do you view the stabbings, especially when they are directed at soldiers?
Well, as an ex-soldier, I learned very personally that if you will not respect existence, you can expect resistance. And this is how people resist. Israel as a state like to use the idea that Palestinians only understand force or power. But the truth of the matter is that Israelis only understand power and force. Every other attempt from Palestinians to try to negotiate this situation in a diplomatic way was countered by more attacks, more oppression, and more occupation, more stealing of the land, more destroying of homes, more settlements being built. We decided to call going into the UN a diplomatic terrorism, and to go into the ICC, international terrorism. We basically describe every form of resistance as terrorism, because the sole idea of the occupation is not to be safe. The sole idea is to create an ethnically cleansed piece of land only for Jewish people, with Palestinian workers. Of course, some Palestinians can stay and do stuff for us, but this is our land. What people maybe don't understand is that Israel is creating the conditions into the situation of constantly having to protect yourself. We're creating this situation by oppressing millions of people into a phase where they have no other choice by resist. So many of these people lost a family member, had been to prison or lost someone in prison, and understood that nothing could be changed. Because the truth is that Israel do not hear the diplomacy. Israel do not hear the calls of Palestinians for equality. What we are seeing in Palestine is what a lot of people like to describe as the most complicated political situation of our time, is probably the most simple political situation of our time. It's a situation about equality.
It's amazing that you say that, Iran, because this is painted as the most complex, the most hard to solve. They've been fighting over there for thousands of years. You hear these things, but really, it really does come down to basic equality and humanity. Would you say that you support the right of Palestinians to fight their occupiers?
Absolutely. I support the right of every human being under an oppressive military rule to resist this military rule by any means possible. I do not believe that Israel have a right to occupy millions of human beings without every decent simple, basic human rights for their name. And I do not believe that Israel would change on its own. At no point in history there was a state or a power that had the power to control over other human beings and benefit from it, and just decided to let go of this power by its own. It was always forced on them by the resistance of the people underneath them or the intervention of other forces around the world. And unfortunately, as I do support the Palestinian right to resist in any way, I do not believe that their resistance is enough. I do believe that the rest of the world have to interfere in what's going on in Palestine. There's nothing else that we can do except for giving all the Palestinians equal rights and starting a new state, a new equality system for all human beings on the ground.